The following is the story about Hendrik Verryt and Ties Habraken and their families during World War II. The details are to the best of our current knowledge. The majority of information used has come from Henk Verryt's website, where he has tirelessly recorded the information, stories and many photographs of the Verryt family. Nicola, Henk and Antoinette Habraken have also provided photographs and information that has helped to tell Hendrik and Ties's story. The outbreak of World War II came at a time of great political and social turmoil. Conditions in Europe had rapidly deteriorated between 1936 and 1939 as the Great Depression took its toll. Germany was also chafing under the yoke of the concessions and reparations meted out to her as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, signed at the end of World War I. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party had gained power in 1933. In the early hours of Friday, September 1st, 1939, the German army stormed across the Polish frontier. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. On May 10th, 1940, Germany invaded Holland. The invasion, based on Blitzkrieg, was swift and devastating. Holland surrendered just 6 days later as her military had been unable to cope with the speed of the Blitzkrieg. Fear was also great. Rotterdam had been severely damaged by bombing. Could the same happen in Amsterdam? The Dutch resistance movement came about because of two simple facts: outrage that their country had been invaded and sheer horror at what happened to Dutch Jews. Holland had swiftly fallen as a result of the onslaught of Blitzkrieg in 1940. There were many in Nazi Germany, including Joseph Goebbels, who had hoped that many Dutch people would absorb National Socialism into their culture. In this, they were wrong. The Dutch rallied around their exiled royal family and the Dutch resistance was born. The Dutch resistance made its mark with a collection of valuable intelligence information for the Allied forces. They also helped Dutch Jews to escape, especially children. They were highly skilled at hiding people and forging identity papers. More than 5,000 Allied airmen successfully travelled along escape lines organised by the Dutch underground, using secret codes and stopping in safe houses. If caught, the airmen risked internment in a POW camp, but the French, Belgian and Dutch civilians who aided them risked torture and even death. Hendrik Verryt, along with the farmhand Ties Habraken, who later became lifelong friends, were involved in clandestine operations under the eyes of the German occupiers. Activities included distribution of literature, including the news from England, and the smuggling of British pilots and other refugees. Hendrik and Ties also sheltered young Dutch farmers, eyed for deportation to Germany to run farms there to fund the Nazi war efforts. The railway that ran near the farm became a transport line for the Germans. At the time, it was forbidden to have a radio, and weapons were punishable by death. They had both. Tony Verryt, Hendrik's oldest son, remembers seeing trains attacked and noted that the British were more accurate than the Americans. Theo and Dan, his younger brothers, also remember the strafing of the trains on the nearby railway and that they had to shelter in a bunker Hendrik had made from a concrete tank with earth piled all around and over it. Also running for cover on another occasion and jumping in the drains as the train which was releasing a smokescreen was being shot at. Dan also recalls running as fast as his little 4-year-old legs would carry him as the warplanes flew overhead. He fell over, but his brothers kept running without him. He remembers Maria sweeping him up in her arms and carrying him to safety. Henk Verryt recalls Hendrik saying that the pilots used the diamonds on the roof of the farmhouse to guide them as they were so distinctive. They would line them up with steeples in the nearby village. The farmhouse was built in 1881 by one of Maria's grandfathers. All the Dutch-born Verryt children were born here, as was Henk Habraken and further generations of Habrakens. Theo recalls having to go and stay at Auntie Nell's in Merlo when the heavy fighting was occurring and coming back home to find crops and fences flattened where the tanks had driven through. Tisa's brother Hein and sister Gerarda were staying at the farmhouse and helping Maria while Hendrik was imprisoned. They were having dinner when the bombing became so intense that they took refuge in the bomb shelter. As they left, a shell ploughed through the back of the house, hit the fireplace, and went through into the area where the stock were kept and lodged in a wall. The Americans later came and removed it. Theo and Tony recall Maria covered the hole in the wall with a plaque of the Madonna and Child. In another incident, Tony recalls that a German soldier stole his bicycle from him as he was walking home from Stiffout with a flat tyre, but that didn't bother the soldier, who cycled off anyway. Teese recalled, "We had found the pistols in a ditch close by our home after the British retreat. A peddler came around to our home and showed us some of the guns he had with him, and we told him about the pistols we had found. He told us he didn't have enough knowledge about them and would bring his brother-in-law, who was more familiar with pistols, the next time. A few days later they returned and the brother-in-law took the pistols with him for repair. The peddler asked his brother-in-law to wait on the street corner while he visited another house. The peddler disliked his brother-in-law so much that he set him up to be arrested and went around the corner and rang the German police. They arrested him and he told them where the guns had come from, so they came back for Hendrik and me. They didn't believe that I had found the pistols." The farmhouse was stormed on the 27th of April 1944 by a party of 8 Germans from the Sicherheitsdienst, sister organisation with the Gestapo. Tony recalls that the informant was in the car to show them the way. They ripped up the tiled floor and dragged the kids out of bed and questioned them. They found the radio in the attic and a revolver under the hay in the adjoining building. Tony remembers, "That night we were raided at 11 o'clock. I woke up and got out of bed but was promptly told to get back in bed. The Germans turned the house upside down. A bit later a German soldier came to my bed and wanted me to identify a jacket. Was it Dad's or did it belong to Teese? I knew it was Dad's, but I told them I didn't know." Tony also remembers how one of the German soldiers angrily threw a box of aluminium balls across the room which Tony had collected. They were used by the British to foil the radar. Both Tony and Theo recall that at the time of the raid there were British pilots hiding above the ceiling. Tony recalls, "Dad was a bit suspicious of the German movements that night, so he made certain that the 4 pilots we had were safe by hiding them in a secure loft over the kitchen. Mum took us out of the way while Dad and Tess Habraken did all this." The loft had a trap door in the kitchen which was not directly visible, and Dad used to keep clandestine wheat up there. Evidently, once the pilots were up there, they put 2 50-kilo sacks of wheat on top of the trap door, and then they sat on top of those. The Germans had a go at the trap door, but of course it didn't budge. It appears that when the Germans found the gun, they considered they had accomplished their goal and never forced the trap door. Evidently, the pilots were crapping themselves. Had the Germans found the airmen, then it is quite probable that none of us who are descendants of Hendrik and Teese would be here today. A sobering thought. Both Hendrik, aged 35, and Teese, aged 25, were arrested and taken away. Maria was left with the children and the comment, "Don't ever expect to see them again." Tony recalls, after the Germans left with their new prisoners and the coast was clear, Mum went to a neighbour who was also in the underground. It was decided to get the pilots to another place for safety in the middle of the night. That was the first time I saw them and was told to keep my mouth shut. How terrible it must have been for Maria, left on her own, looking after the farm and 4 children, not knowing if her husband will ever come home alive. What an amazing, brave, strong woman she was. And for the Habraken family, not knowing the fate of their son and brother, such a young man with his whole life ahead of him. In Hendrik and Tessa's absence, the Habraken family rallied around to keep the farm running and to help Maria. Tony recalls Dad and Tess were taken to Eindhoven prison and were being questioned by the Germans. Dad said after the war that the bloke who gave them away to the Germans was there to give evidence, and Dad said that the senior officer asked this bloke what else there was. Referring to Tess, he said, "If you go to his brother-in-law, you will find a lot more." When Dad heard that, he said to the senior officer, "Excuse me, but Tess has no married sisters." So the senior officer turned to Tess and asked, "Is that correct?" Tess answered, "That's correct, you can ask the authorities." The senior officer turned around and gave the informant a whack that sent him right across the room and promptly arrested him for giving false information. The 2 men were charged with possession of firearms, assisting underground refugees, possession of a radio, and falsifying passports. Tess recalled, "We were taken to Amersfoort, which is a camp in Holland. Not much information is recorded concerning living conditions in this camp. What is known is that thousands of Dutch and Belgian civilians received harsh and cruel treatment at the hands of the Nazis. Hundreds were executed at this camp. During the years of 1941 to 1945, over 35,000 prisoners were kept here." Records show that they also spent time in the prison at Wolvenplein, Utrecht, where they were to stand trial, which was delayed a couple of times. This is a letter from Maria requesting permission to visit her husband. The translation reads, "The undersigned wife of H.T. Verryt, arrested and detained at the German prison at Wolvenplein, born in Ostend, 24th of August 1908, and living at the above noted, respectfully requests permission to visit her above-named husband to discuss matters related to rebuilding. I close with thanks for your consideration and respectfully await your reply. Yours, M.A. Verryt." On the 5th of September 1944, without a judgment, they were suddenly and without warning transported into Germany by train. Hendrik related later that they had been unable to contact their families, but in the hope that they might get a message back home, they scribbled notes with a pencil and pushed them out through the cracks in the wagons, hoping that some of them would get back to their loved ones. Translation of Hendrik's note. "Dearest wife, we are being transported to Germany. We are being treated well and enough food. Keep your spirits up as we have to. We are in good health and trust in God, who is our only hope." Enclosed with the note was a letter from the person who found it. The translation of the letter reads, "Enclosed greetings from your family member. The notes were found this afternoon by the railway. The train passed here at 12:30 and also transported women and children. The sky was cloudy and there were no British planes flying. May God give you strength and reunite you soon in your homeland." This was sent from Born, Holland, near the German border. They were detained as prisoners in Lager Rollwald, also known as Dieburg Rodgau, and KZ Waldorf. KZ Waldorf was a subcamp of the Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp near the village of Waldorf in Hesse. From 1943 it was used as a forced labour camp of the Rodgau-Dieburg prison. Prisoners in Nazi labour camps were worked to death on short rations and in bad conditions, or killed if they were unable to work. Many died as a direct result of forced labour under the Nazis. Tess recalls this forced labour. In Dieburg they would load us into cattle trucks and drive 3/4 of an hour to Darmstadt, where we were taken to an airstrip to fill in the bomb craters with shingle so the planes could take off. Sometimes we would have to jump in them ourselves to shelter from planes dropping more bombs on the airstrip. We also repaired railway lines which had been bombed. Dan recalls his father telling him that although life was very tough in the camps, there were a few of the German guards who actually were kind and tried to improve their situation. A prisoner who was becoming weak and sick might be moved to kitchen detail in order to become stronger. He said that occasionally he would be lucky enough to get a smoke or some extra food from a guard. These were exceptions to the rule, and generally their treatment was harsh. Tess recalled, "We were whipped. I had many hidings for doing things wrong or not giving information. One torture was with 2 gun barrels. One would hit me in the chest and another hard in the back." If the situation seemed bad enough in this prison camp, then it was going to get worse. By January 1945, the Third Reich stood on the verge of military defeat. Most of German East Prussia was already under Soviet occupation. Soviet forces besieged Warsaw, Poland, and Budapest, Hungary, as they prepared to push German forces back towards the interior of the Reich. Anglo-American forces in the west were also ready to invade Germany. From camps in all directions that lay in the line of fire, the prisoners and guards departed in March and April to avoid the approaching front. In the days that followed, the already weak prisoners were marched 40 kilometres a day. Food was scarce, and prisoners resorted to eating raw slugs. What made it worse was that they had no idea where they were going or what fate awaited them. The SS guards had strict orders to kill prisoners who could no longer walk or travel. The number who died of exhaustion and exposure along the routes increased dramatically. This encouraged an understandable perception among the prisoners that the Germans intended them all to die on the march. The term Death March was probably coined by concentration camp prisoners. Forced marches were especially common in late 1944 and 1945 as the SS evacuated prisoners to camps deeper within Germany. To almost the last day of the war, German authorities marched prisoners to various locations in the Reich. As a result, Hendrik and Tess ended up in Bernau am Chiemsee in southern Bavaria. Tess recalled, "The Allies began approaching, and so the Germans then moved us to Bernau, which was right on the border with Austria. It took 10 days, walking at night and sleeping in the bush during the day, to reach Bernau." Dan recalls his father telling him that as they marched, German housewives would sometimes throw food over the garden fences for them, and that some of the guards would turn a blind eye, allowing the prisoners to gather up the precious food. There is also reason to believe that Hendrik and Tess passed through Dachau on their way to Bernau. The liberation of the Netherlands took just over 7 months to complete, though the liberation began when Allied troops entered Maastricht on September 13, 1944, the Dutch weren't completely liberated until May 5, 1945. After suffering harsh conditions under Nazi occupation, the Dutch enthusiastically welcomed Allied forces, led by the Canadian Army, as they made their way through the country. As Allied forces advanced into the heart of Germany, they liberated hundreds of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. Hendrik and Tess were liberated on the 3rd of May 1945 by the Americans. Incidentally, the 4th of May is Dutch Freedom Day. Tess recalled, "Americans came to Bernau and shot the lock off the gates and then set us free." Hendrik told of the liberation in his recollection that a single soldier came through the gate. In later years, he said he would have liked to have been able to thank him if he could know who it was. The German armed forces surrendered unconditionally in the west on May the 7th and in the east on May the 9th, 1945. May 8th, 1945 was proclaimed Victory in Europe Day. The war was finally over. Tess recalled, "I and some other prisoners then stole some German officer bikes and started our long ride to Munich. Halfway there we were picked up by some American soldiers who told us not to take the bikes and drove us to Munich instead." Tees remembers there being a huge pile of motorbikes there, so they obviously hadn't been the only ones who had decided to help themselves to a motorbike. Once in Munich, they were processed by American Expeditionary Forces and cared for briefly in a displaced person camp before being put on a train to Helmand. Henk Habraken recalls his father telling him about how when they were given their first decent meal, Hendrik overdid it and his malnourished system couldn't take it. He was in agony with a terrible stomachache. He asked Tees to find him some wine, as that would help his digestion. Tees was able to get some wine off a local priest, and it did the trick. Dan remembers how skinny both Hendrik and Tees were when they came home. Henk recalls, Mum told me that they had heard that Dad and Tees were close to home and a group went out to meet them. The dog must have been jumping in glee because it's all blurry in the photo. Dan remembers this day too. He waited for his father on the sand road and afterwards there was a big party in the threshing shed. Some of the Habraken boys had been out catching rabbits for the party. After returning home, Hendrik came into possession of his first four-wheeled vehicle, a Willys two-seater Jeep which the Americans had left behind. The war was no sooner over and the threats of the Cold War were evident. The communist desire for world domination and the fragile peace in Europe were underscored by the threat of nuclear weapons. It seemed that they could be let loose at any time as the peace was based on the deterrent factor and each side kept escalating its nuclear capabilities. Fearing a repetition of what they had been through, and taking into account the future of their 6 sons who were expected to carry on farming, they considered a proposition by a visiting Dutch priest. He suggested they immigrate to Australia or New Zealand, where there were positions available on dairy farms belonging to the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. Along with that was the positive stimulation by the Dutch government, who, considering the land full, supported immigration, even then, but more so later when those immigrating received assisted passages. At this time, though, 1949, assistance was only in the form of information and positive stimulation. The date is the 2nd of June 1949, the culmination of the process set in motion by the war years. The Verryt family readied themselves for departure from their home and land of birth for a distant country they had only read about. They arrived in Auckland on the 23rd of August 1949. The story goes that when the official entry documents were being prepared, the authorities did not dot the I and J, and that henceforth it became a Y. The Habraken family followed suit in 1955, arriving in New Zealand via Wellington. Over the years, both families have remained close and have thrived in New Zealand. The dream of providing a safe place for their children to grow up was finally realised. The farmhouse, which has seen so much history, including being a safe house, and has been home to generations of Verryts and Habrakens, is set to be demolished. Sadly, it does not meet the criteria as a historical building, despite being over 130 years old, because it had been partially rebuilt following a fire around 1940. 70 years after Hendrik and Thies were liberated, we remember them with great love and pride. What remarkable, brave and strong people they were.